So, first question. If someone just flatly asked you, what's your number one accomplishment of your first term? What is it?
You know, I have to say, I really believe I've brought constituent services to a new level for the city council, and in particular for residents of District 1. I've raised the bar, and it's one of those things that I keep hearing about on the doors when I'm door knocking. Everybody has a story of a way that either I helped them or helped one of their neighbors or a friend of theirs. And so it's, maybe not a policy victory, although I feel like I have plenty of those that I'm proud of. But for me, the reason why constituent services are so important is because it's the thing that we do that lets the public know that we're working for them. And you've heard me say this before, I really believe that when we're empowering our neighbors to get City Hall to be working for them on the nuts and bolts things that affect their day-to-day lives, we can really restore people's faith in their government, their faith in democracy, and their belief that we're going to be able to work together on the big challenges.
You certainly challenged, rather championed a lot of policies, though. So if we throw out constituent services, which one of those would be your top accomplishment?
I would say it's a tie between the secure scheduling legislation for large retailers and large chain restaurants that gives certainty to service workers and retail workers about what their schedule is in advance of receiving it. There are a lot of folks who are having to work 2 and 3 jobs at a time while going to school and having to care for family members, and having certainty of what their schedule is 2 weeks in advance is really important. When Seattle passed that law, there was only one other city that had a similar law. Now it's spread across the country in a half a dozen municipalities. It was brought up in the state legislature this year during the 2019 state legislative session by our representatives. The other accomplishment that I'm really proud of is convincing the city to use our bond authority to build housing. It was $29 million in additional funds to build truly affordable housing, and we're going to replicate that. And we're going to replicate that in a way that will allow us to double our spending on truly affordable rent-restricted units in the city. We're looking at doing that again this coming year.
So for the average person, though, that's a little bit wonky. They're looking at you and really nuts and bolts services, and even if you've accomplished constituent services, doing that for this person over here doesn't mean these 5 people over there have personal experience with it. So anything in the more nutsy and boltsy arena?
So the policy pieces might seem wonky, but again, I ran on making sure that we have better laws for our workforce and making sure that we're building more affordable housing. So I think it's really important. As far as what some of the nuts and bolts type things are, it's a range of accomplishments, from getting streetlights repaired on a street where there have been a series of assaults, and folks feel that better lighting in the area will make that area more safe, to working with people on adjusting their city light bills and their Seattle Public Utilities bills, or making sure that the garbage collection happens when it's supposed to happen, to working on getting abandoned buildings in their neighborhoods boarded up, passing a new law to require the city to monitor those buildings. It's a whole range of things, but it's really what I'm working on at any given time as it relates to constituent services is driven by the contact that I have with the public.
What's the number one amount of unfinished business that you might have?
So I think as far as unfinished business, again, this is something that I ran on in 2015, and we've made some important progress, but we haven't sealed the deal, is developer impact fees. Specifically as it relates to transportation developer impact fees, we're actually being sued right now by an attorney who represents developers, as well as a lobbyist that represents developers, in our attempts to amend the comp plan to add what's called a transportation project list. And we have to amend the comp plan to add that project list in order to implement developer impact fees that will help pay for those projects. So that's on hold right now. We have the legislation and we're ready to move forward with it as soon as we hear the results of the lawsuit. We're confident that we will prevail, though, because the action that we're taking is really an administrative action. The comp plan, state law requires that we have those projects in the comp plan before we pass legislation to enact developer impact fees. But I have done quite a bit as it relates to utility charges. So there's something called water connection charge and tap fees, and ratepayers were subsidizing those for developers when they built new buildings. And so we have administratively, I've been working with Seattle Public Utilities in shifting those costs that were borne by ratepayers over to developers. We don't usually talk about those as impact fees, but they are another type of impact fees that other jurisdictions throughout the state use and that the city of Seattle hadn't been using.
So if the other kind of impact fee is the one that's currently sort of tied up in litigation happens, what will that look like?
So it'll be a fee assessed on folks when they're building housing or commercial properties, and that fee will be used to help offset the costs associated with the projects on the project list. We have to be really careful that we are not charging developers for the costs associated with projects that are addressing a backlog of transportation infrastructure. It can only be for projects associated with addressing new impacts of development and those transportation impacts associated.
I know there's a certain group of people that say that the more fees you put on developers, we're just getting further away from affordable housing.
Yeah, there are a couple different economic analyses about that. One says that when you increase the cost of building housing, that the developer will pass those costs on to the consumers of the housing, whether or not it's homeowners or renters. There's another school of thought, equally bright economists, who say that the cost isn't passed on to the renter or the purchaser of a home, because what happens is when the city changes its approach to what they will charge for development, that actually goes into the cost of the land, and so it actually drives the cost of the land down, because there's this new, and MHA is another good example. The folks who gave us an economic analysis before doing MHA argued that it's not going to increase the cost of housing, but what it will do is it will make the land a little less expensive, because there is this sort of encumbrance that is now part of city law that affects the property value.
Speaking of MHA, so that was an interesting process, and you had some amendments that made it through. Really, the only thing that to any degree moderated it, if you will, at least from some people's viewpoint. Are we done with that? Is there anything in the next 4 years that you think is going to come up to amend it, change it, add to it?
Yeah, I mean, I think stationary planning in the junction is going to result in some proposals for zoning increases. And the folks who I worked with at Juneau, the Junction Neighborhood Organization, they weren't opposed to zoning increases, but they wanted it to be part of a planning process that's focused around a light rail alignment. And so they've already, the Office of Planning and Community Development has already come out and met with them and talked to them a little bit about what the planning process is going to look like. And I've received commitments from the planning office that they will begin neighborhood planning around station-oriented development in 2020. So I expect there to be a zoning proposal that will accompany that.
Right. Well, we were at that Juneau meeting somewhat recently, but citywide was what actually passed. Was that a first step, or was that largely, what was going to happen.
I mean, I think is the primary objective was really focused on ensuring that we had included in our laws this obligation. I think that's really the primary purpose, is what do we do to add the obligation for people building housing to contribute to affordable housing, truly affordable housing. And so I think the primary objective of that legislation was less about the zoning and more about creating this new obligation on builders, no matter what they're building, no matter where they're building it in the city. People often will compare Seattle to other cities that have inclusionary zoning policies and say, point to the fact that our obligation is lower as a percentage or as a fee than other cities, but there aren't any other cities. Most cities are target particular neighborhoods. And only do it for residential. Seattle is the only city that I'm aware of that is doing it everywhere throughout the city, both commercial and residential development. So I think it's going to be really important that we monitor the program and make sure that we are hitting our marks on what we anticipate getting out of it as it relates to numbers of units. And if we're not, I think we need to go back and look at that fee structure and look at the performance structure and make sure that we're getting the number of units that we intend to get out of that program.
Were there provisos or checkpoints built into it, kind of like?
There are, yeah. There are checkpoints associated with the performance, but there are also checkpoints associated with making adjustments for the cost of living, so that and inflation basically.
So also on the subject of zoning and development, we've been asking everybody about this. It seems almost certain, given the Planning Commission's Neighborhoods for All report, that the issue of ending single-family zoning will come before the next council term. Right. Where are you on that?
So, I've read not the entire report, but I've read portions of the report, and what I see them saying about ending single-family zoning is really about nomenclature, right? They don't. I think the idea that we change the name from single-family zoning to something else is more about how single-family zoning works now, right? There aren't single families living in all of the single-family structures, right? And so if you look at that first recommendation, it's really about what we call those neighborhoods, but then you go into some of the other strategies, and they do talk about allowing different types of structures on the corners, near arterials, and on the and alleys, and on the edges of zones. And I think that's worth looking at. And I think maybe talking about the reality is that single-family zoning really looks more like what we are now calling within the urban villages residential small lot. And so, that term single-family zoning is, as in language, is exclusionary, because you're suggesting that only single families live in that housing. And again, 20% of single-family zoned properties are occupied by renters.
But with the Planning Commission running this out in a couple of open houses north of town, and by the way, no one on the Planning Commission is from south of downtown. Where's the transparency in that? Why wasn't there more? Why isn't it wider? Why isn't more places?
So I think they're just, as far as I'm aware, they're just beginning the conversation. I mean, they've issued their report. They're doing a road tour on it, but to my knowledge, they're not done with the conversation.
That's kind of how Hala started, though. It started small, and that's why I think it's worth paying attention to at this point.
I'm definitely paying attention to it, but you remember as much as I do as it relates to Hala and MHA that as it came after. People 3 years ago, people thought that we were going to be voting on it within the next couple months. And, I spent a lot of time explaining that, again, this is the beginning of a process. We don't, and it's not even the legislative process yet, right? This is a particular set of stakeholders that has a particular set of recommendations that they're talking about throughout the city. There will be, at some point, there will be a process that the executive with the planning office will then begin. And then, if there's a recommendation that comes out of that, that will come to the council. And these aren't changes that are going to happen overnight. But I don't think there are, that there are ideas that in that report that we should not talk about.
Separate from that, though, there are some very, very loud voices currently that say, single-family zoning, it's awful, it's horrible. We should just get rid of it. So you're willing. Bottom line, though, you're willing to look at least some changes.
I am willing to look at some changes, and again, the kind of modest changes that recognize how we actually use our single-family zones now, I think are worthy of consideration. Looking at having something other than a single-family property on a corner lot, allowing for maybe some mixed use with retail on the bottom and some housing units on the top on a corner. I think that there are places where that will work. I don't think it should be a citywide proposal. I think it should be informed by planning in neighborhoods, though. Another one of their recommendations is looking at increasing the walk shed to make larger the urban villages, and looking at expanding the urban villages to a 15-minute walk shed. I think that's a reasonable thing to take a look at. But I don't want to pretend that it's not true that there are people who are speaking about single-family zoning in a way that all people who live in houses in single-family zoning are somehow perpetuating racist redline by their presence in that zone and their desire to preserve what they like about their neighborhoods. I don't think that's a good way to have a conversation either.
Well, then we'll ask you now the question we've asked the other two. Do the urbanists hold too much sway in the city?
It's not, I don't think it's a question of whether or not they hold too much sway. I actually had an interview today with the publication, The Urbanist. I just don't like the way we're having these conversations, right? I feel like the way that we're having these conversations leads to really unfair characteristics of people who care about their city. I don't like it that because people want to see at the table when these really important land use decisions are being made and they want to be involved in planning, that they're called NIMBYs. I think that is really an incredibly toxic way to have a conversation with people who care about their city. And another example is the golf course issue, right? People are getting sort of forced into one corner or the other, and I just think, again, that's a toxic way to have a conversation. And no, I'm not going to say I have an opinion until I learn more about the city's analysis of how the golf courses are working. I mean, they've pointed out that there are other jurisdictions that have a approach in their golf courses where it allows for multi-purpose use. They point out the St. Andrews Golf Course in Scotland, and as you guys know, folks in the Junction neighborhood have a lot of frustration about how the West Seattle Golf Course counts against their open space. And anytime they come to the Parks Department looking for funds to increase open space, they're told no, according to our analysis, you have enough because you've got the golf course. So I think having a conversation about the use of our golf courses is a valid thing to talk about. But people are being put into one corner or the other. Either you're against affordable housing because you want to preserve the golf courses, or you don't care about open space if you're willing to have a conversation about the current use of golf courses.
Oh, it's funny. That's one of our other issues.
Right.
Is the golf course question? To be clear for people though, because there seems to be a great amount of confusion. Because I've seen lots of stuff go by on social media and elsewhere. People say the city council is currently proposing selling off the golf courses. There's no legislation currently before you guys, as far as I know.
There is no legislation before us. No, the executive through the Parks Department has done a study. The Lund report, and the recommendations or the study itself is actually very favorable to retention of golf courses. What I expect will happen is that the mayor will have some sort of a stakeholder engagement around that study as sort of the jumping off point to have a group of folks who are stakeholders in this conversation and will at some point potentially make some sort of a recommendation. There's nothing before the council though at this time.
That's what I thought. Speaking of the executive, so at several forums now, we've seen you get the question about giving yourself and the council grade, and the most recent time, and then the person I believe that asked for elaboration on, well, why are some people so grumpy if the performance is B minus, and your answer was basically that you don't think that people totally understand what the council's accountable for and how it works.
Yeah.
Can you elaborate on that? And if that really is the only problem, would people be giving you an A if they knew how the council works?
Well, I think we're getting unfairly blamed for a lot of things that are out of our control. Again, the concerns that people have around public safety and this notion out there that that the Seattle City Council is tying police officers' hands. We don't tell the police department what laws to enforce. We're not in the chain of command. And the charter delegates the authority to the police chief for making decisions about deployment of police officers and for what priorities. So that's one example, and it happens to be the thing that people are most upset about, is about the city's approach towards dealing with unsheltered homelessness. And the other piece of it is people don't realize how much the city is doing, particularly as it relates to encampment removals, right? There's this meme out there that the city doesn't remove encampments, and that's not true. I get a report every week of the locations where the city will be, the navigation team, to remove locations that have been identified as high priorities. And they're out there doing about a dozen a week right now. So, and they're focused on street right-of-ways and sidewalks and parks. So, but, again, the police department's hands are tied is really more of a function of their need to prioritize police resources and balance those priorities between addressing unsheltered homelessness and dealing with traditional law enforcement duties. Right? If they spent all of their time chasing people around the city and removing encampments, how would they be able to, respond to 911 calls or do proactive policing?
So how do we get to this point, though, where somehow people think that you guys are tying the hands of the police?
I don't know, really, to tell you the truth. It's perplexing to me. I don't really have a good sense of how we got to this point. I think there's a perception that the city council doesn't support its police department, and the most objective measure that I have to demonstrate my support of the police department is the fact that in the 3.5 years that I've been on the council, the police department's budget has increased from $300 million a year to $400 million a year. So that's $100 million. And those are votes I took. We voted in favor of a $40 million package for back pay for the years that they had not yet finished negotiating a contract with the city. So we pay back pay. We also recently passed legislation to have a $10,000 hiring bonus. So $10,000 for new officers as well as lateral hires. The police department is now the highest paid police department in the state. These are the things. We've increased the funding for officers, and this is funding that some of it we've used, but we've backslid on our hiring goals. But these are the things that the city council can do. We pass laws and we pass the budget. That is the objective measure that I have for my support of the police department. I pursued a community service officer program because I know that police officers want to get back to traditional law enforcement activities, and the CSOs can help take on some of the burden that police officers have been taking on as acting more as sort of social workers. The CSOs can do that now.
One particular police support measure that one of your opponents keeps bringing up, Brendan Colding, I know it's happened also at forums that you've been at as well, is the business that when Councilmember Sawant said that police officers had committed murder in a fatal officer-involved shooting, that you and other colleagues didn't directly disavow that. Mm-hmm. What's your response to that?
I mean, in retrospect, that is something maybe I would reconsider, but we don't have sort of a culture on the council of criticizing one another publicly, with the exception of Councilmember Sawant. Councilmember Sawant doesn't have any problem calling us, corporate lapdogs, but other council members, and I think it's just the culture of the councils, we don't criticize one another publicly because those council members are elected and they will be held accountable for their actions and their statements by the voters.
So, even if somebody said something so outrageous, though, you guys generally don't. I can't think of a specific incident because, but yeah, that's just not the council's culture.
Right.
So that's the explanation for why you wouldn't have said that. Anything more that you think that should be done back on the subject of policing and safety? You often bring up the money for police, the CSOs, but anything else that can or should be done? Because certainly you've heard the concerns from people around, and I don't mean homelessness really, I mean more crime.
Mm-hmm. So I think one of the things that I'm interested in taking a look at that has been revealed with the prolific offenders report, that the directors of several business improvement areas commissioned, is the need for more funding for programs like Vital. Vital is a program that works both between King County and the city attorney's office. And right now they have funding for about a 60-person caseload, and it is precisely that caseload is made up of people like those that we saw on the prolific offenders list. And we know that population of folks, even though that report only profiled the criminal histories of 100 people, the estimates of the number of people that would fit that criteria of more than 4 times of cycling through the King County Jail over a 12-month period is much larger than that 100 count that was taken as sort of a moment in time. And so given that population is probably more like 500 people, we need programs like Vital to address the underlying issues that are leading people to make bad choices. And so this program, Vital, got a great success as it relates specifically to reducing recidivism in this particular population of people, but it simply isn't well funded. The prolific offenders report, one of the things that it did not make a distinction between is because King County Jail houses both people that the city prosecutor prosecutes as well as the county prosecutor prosecutes. It didn't make a distinction between which population of folks was in the city's responsibility versus the county's responsibility. And I think that's important. I'm not saying that to quibble with the report. I think if you're looking at a system that's broken, you need to look at which components are broken and where the resources are needed.
Yeah, that's an educational point off in explaining the difference between what the city prosecutes and what the county prosecutes. Although both seem to be at the moment equally somewhat broken. Also on a public safety point, although it certainly could apply to other issues, you've raised concerns often about a variety of things, or proposed something, and then not necessarily been able to convert because it requires 5 more votes or whatever, or it requires the executive's office to do something. I'm thinking this week, for example, the fireworks issue and the fact that you've written the mayor letters 2 years in a row. And so some would say you're not effective enough because you can't just make that happen. How do you?
I mean, that's another
explain?
great example of the fact that I'm not a police officer, right? I'm not the chief of police. I'm not in the executive. I don't have the authority to make the police chief tell her officers when responding to fireworks calls to, for instance, confiscate people's fireworks. We've done the analysis that shows the number of complaints that are coming from our neighbors. So that's what I do is I do the analysis to show the need. But as it relates to this, it's not a legislative issue. So I have to try to use the bully pulpit.
Do you think that you could be any more effective? Is there some way that you could, and somehow, because somebody has to, and you're the only person that's directly representing this area?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose I could, for instance, encourage people to call the mayor's office and let them know that they care about this issue. Somehow, I'm not quite sure how, somebody got my personal phone number and called me yesterday to thank me for putting pressure on the mayor's office about fireworks enforcement. It's not somebody I'd ever talked to before, to my knowledge, but somehow they had my number and called me to thank me.
You'd be surprised at what can wind up on Google, etc.
Right?
So another issue we've been asking everybody about, and we asked about it earlier, but we wanted to ask about it in a slightly different way. So the issue of annexing White Center hasn't really come up, at least in recent years. But I always get the sense that it could at some point just magically spring out of the executive's office or somewhere. And of course the answer is usually well, that's up to the people who live there. So let's say that the people who live there wanted to be annexed. Do you think that would be that bringing White Center into the city would be a benefit for Seattle, or something that it maybe shouldn't be taking on right now?
I think it really depends on the agreements that we would strike with King County about who's responsible for what infrastructure. That's what the holdup is right now. They are trying to negotiate the sliver by the river. For years, right? And that's a relatively small part of South Park. And the idea is that they would use the agreements that they're able to compromise on in those negotiations to serve as the foundation for this larger annexation in North Highline. But they're, both sides are sort of standing tough. We have King County saying, well, we don't have the resources necessary to pay for that infrastructure. And we have Seattle saying, well, we have a backlog of infrastructure needs as well. And that's been sort of my feeling about North Highline. I have neighborhoods in my district that are often neglected by the city, and I don't want to just have yet another neighborhood that's sort of on the bottom of the list for city investment.
One question we've asked along these lines, that comes from our time over in White Center, is that there's a King County Library and the Highline Schools. Would you be amenable to leaving that as a King County Library and leaving the schools with the Highline District?
If that is something that I think there would need to be a conversation about the cost-benefit analysis of doing that. It's not something that I don't have a clear answer on it without, again, doing more of an analysis of who that would serve and how that would impact the constituents in District 1 now.
Transportation. So with the new price tag, is the roundabout dead in Highland Park?
I don't think so. You know, we have a constituent who is a traffic engineer. He has designed a more cost-efficient, smaller roundabout, still an arterial roundabout. SDOT's looking at it. I believe that people at SDOT really want to see this project happen. I am at a loss for how the costs ballooned in such a short period of time. But, you know, this project is now in SDOT's CIP, in its capital improvement program. And we have dollars that are committed to the project, and we just have to keep adding dollars to it using the budget process in order to get it to that next step where we get through design, we get the funds necessary to complete design. I think it'll make it easier once we get over that hump to get construction dollars. And I know also our state delegation has a real interest in the project as well. So, you know, I put together a group of neighbors at the beginning of the state legislative session to meet with representatives Cody and Fitzgibbons and Senator Nguyen. They actually, outside of sort of the normal grant process, they put in a budget request. It didn't get through, but it's on their radar.
Fauntleroy Boulevard. Mm-hmm. So we've gone into the environmental study process, and that was supposed to be the next touchstone, but is that money still sitting there somewhere? What's the status of all that?
It is. They have committed to me and to the community that money is going to stay put until SDOT makes a decision about moving forward, and I think they're really close to doing so.
Besides those two issues, and separate from light rail, because we know that's kind of the number one thing on the front burner right now, but what else is a huge transportation priority for District 1 that you're kind of focused on?
Pavement condition. Yeah. It's one of those issues that doesn't have a constituent group for it, but nevertheless, the pavement condition affects all of the sort of mode-specific constituent groups, right? It affects transit riders, it affects freight mobility, it affects people who drive their cars, and it affects bicyclists. And because there isn't an interest group, you know, really focused on making sure our arterial paving goals are met, our arterial paving goals in the MOVE levy, I think we've really fallen behind, and we have several segments here in District 1 that are considered by SDOT to be failing segments, and so I really want to get SDOT's commitment that they are going to address those failed segments on 35th and on Roxbury.
As if you were reading my mind. Back to one election-related question. So, whether they're the majority or not, we'll know once the votes are counted. There's something of a loud voice clamoring for change. Mm-hmm. So, when you make the case for why it should be you and not change, considering that things haven't been going giantly fabulously, what's the case you make? Why should it not be one of those other guys? Mm-hmm.
Well, again, you know, the response I'm getting from people at the doors is one of, you know, gratitude and appreciation for the work I've done. You know, I had a woman, I was walking over to office hours yesterday over at the West Seattle Senior Center, and a woman ran up to me on the street to thank me. And, you know, before I started door knocking, I was a little nervous because of the sort of anti-incumbency sentiment throughout the city. And I'm just getting really good response from people. People feel represented by me in City Hall.
One of the sort of anti-council points is that the council's anti-business. In fact, one campaign is based on that. Tell us about your meetings with the West Seattle business owners that you've had. What are the topics? What did you talk about?
So, I think the main issue that I have engaged with the West Seattle businesses on, as it relates to a policy issue, was secure scheduling and the employee hours tax. I reached out to the West Seattle Chamber as it relates to MHA to see whether or not there were specific elements of the proposal that they were interested in having me weigh in on their behalf. Didn't get a response from my efforts to engage the West Seattle Business Association. I'm sorry, the West Seattle Chamber, but did work with the Junction BIA a little bit. But likewise on the employee hours tax, Councilmember Gonzalez and I reached out to the West Seattle Chamber and asked them to work with us to organize a forum. We heard from business owners, and we made some changes after we didn't just meet with the West Seattle Chamber. We were doing sort of a road show with business chambers throughout the city, because if you recall, we invited the Greater Seattle Chamber of Commerce to participate in our stakeholder process before developing a proposal, and they declined to participate. But as it relates to constituent issues, I'm gonna be honest, I'm frustrated that West Seattle businesses don't, as a rule, reach out. There are definitely some notable exceptions, but as a rule, don't reach out for my help, because business owners all across the city do. And as I mentioned before we got the interview started, I'm doing vignettes with video vignettes with business owners throughout the city, who again are grateful to the work that I've done with them to help them when they didn't get a response from their own council member in their own district. I am really lucky to count as supporters of my campaign business owners like John Bennett at Luna Park, business owners like Dan Black at Zeke's. But it does seem like there are a few business owners who just for some reason, when they're trying to deal with the city department, don't reach out to me for help, unlike business owners throughout the city. I just was talking to the owner of Fantagraphics down in Georgetown today, and he was so grateful because I negotiated on behalf of the business district in Georgetown with the special events office on the cost of the permit that they have to take out every year for the Georgetown Carnival. The city was charging an astronomical fee for the Georgetown Carnival permit, and I worked with the Office of Economic Development to reduce that fee. I just also was talking to John Bennett, and he and I worked together to get a reduction in a charge that SDCI was trying to levy against him as well. So I'm happy to do that kind of, not just constituent work for people who live in our district, but people who work and run businesses in our district as well.
You mentioned the employee hours tax. I was curious. We heard from one of your opponents about the big event at Amazon recently.
Mm-hmm.
Did the subject of your trip to New York come up while you were there?
It did. Yeah, a couple people asked me about it. But again, it's been a year since the council unanimously passed the employee hours tax and then voted to repeal it. And actually, I'm really proud of what's happened in the last year. In the last year, some of our largest businesses have stepped up to the plate, and collectively, there's $700 million on the table for our region for housing and homelessness that wasn't there before. Voluntarily. They have agreed in doing so, in putting $700 million on the table that wasn't there before. They have noticed, they have recognized that they're not doing enough to address the crisis of homelessness and housing in our city. I'm also really encouraged by the fact that Salesforce has announced that Seattle is its new HQ2. The CEO jokingly refers to it as HQ2. And, this is the man who got billboards with his face all over town in San Francisco and convinced voters to pass a $300 million employee hours tax in San Francisco. So I think the question of progressive taxation is going to continue to come up because people, I think, talking about Dan Black, the owner of Zeke's again, his position is that small business owners have to realize that when large business owners aren't paying their fair share, that means that small business owners also are paying a disproportionate amount of the resources necessary to run the city.
God knows. Sports question?
Time for the sports question, I guess.
Oh, no.
This came up kind of inadvertently in one of our others, but you actually made national television regarding an NBA franchise for the city of Seattle.
Indeed.
We are underway for hockey.
Mhm.
What do you think the city should do should an NBA franchise become available?
Well, we've done what I think we need to do in order to make that happen. I don't know what else what other role the city would have to play. We've worked and come up with a great plan for a new arena that will work for both hockey and for basketball.
So you think the Chris Hansen idea is dead? It seems that still somehow people keep thinking it's not totally dead.
A separate stadium.
Yeah, I hear people saying that, but again, this arena that we're building now will work for basketball.
Got anything else?
Yep.
Thank you.
All right.